The gentleman's name is Plaintiff M47. He has a fascinating, well, I find that he has a fascinating background. So he's not even sure what continent he was born on. We think he comes from West Saharan origins, which is one of the world's largest disputed territories in northwest Africa. Morocco, Algeria, and there's a freedom movement going on there, but it's an incredibly poor, sparsely populated area. We think his mother was in or around the West Sahara, that she was taken to the Canary Islands, which is close by and operated by Spain or owned by Spain, for the birth. Then we think he was, because that was a common practice at the time, we think he lived in the Western Sahara for approximately 6 years, where we think his mother died or she disappeared. He was then smuggled to the Canary Islands, where he was placed in a Spanish orphanage, we think, because he remembers lots of children in beds. The orphanage became very crowded, so he was transferred to Madrid, which is how he ends up in Europe. So he's in an orphanage in Madrid for a year or two. Doesn't cope very well, that he's used to being on the streets and playing around. It's unclear if he'd even been in a building before. He ended up in the orphanage. So he escaped, went through France, arrived in Belgium, where a gentleman said, you're 8, 9 years old, you can come live with me, I'll look after you. Yeah, that perhaps wasn't a good move. So he was made a house slave for approximately 2 years in the middle of Brussels. So he wasn't allowed outside, had to tend, this gentleman had a chicken business, the chickens, no education, no medical care, really slept in the garage. After approximately 2 years, the family that he was living with went out one day and left the doors unlocked. So he escaped, made his way to Holland, where he was really picked up and targeted by a criminal gang because he had no identity, he had no papers, he didn't really have a background. So he became very useful to a combined North African Nordic gang. And from there he moved through a variety of countries and ended up in Norway. So his country of origin for the purposes of Australian law is Norway. And no one's ever going to get refugee status or be protected by Australia when they are deemed as originating from Norway. So when he was in Norway, he started going to school for the first time. And he realised there was this different life than to a gang life. And he wanted that different life. He wanted a family, he wanted care. He had this amazing school teacher who would take him to the mountains and go skiing and just introduce him to these different concepts. So he was really conflicted between the gang life, which for him was his family. They'd fed him, they'd clothed him, they'd given him a purpose, and then being exposed to what we would call a normal life. So he kept trying to get to Canada, because that's the dream for many North African asylum seekers and refugees or stateless people. And he kept being deported back from various places. So randomly he was deported to Iceland, for example. So he speaks Arabic, French, Dutch, German, Icelandic, Norwegian, English. There's a few other ones in there. So he's incredibly, he was so useful to this gang because he could travel around Europe on various papers with no real identity and with all these language skills. Eventually he decided the gang life was not for him. So we think when he was approximately 19, maybe 20, so his birth date is a guesstimate from a wrist bone test, and then the day he got the results, he decided that could be his actual birthday. So he flew to Australia thinking that he could just get a boat to New Zealand. I don't think he'd done his research very well. And that New Zealand is the furthest place away from Norway, and he would be safe there. So he got to Australia and was intercepted, and he's been in Australian detention centres ever since.